What the court held is that sex cannot be understood just as one's biological features. Sex, the understanding for sex has to be expanded. Sex should include gender and gender attributes. In addition to biological attributes, it should include gender identity and gender expression. And so the court, expanded the meaning of sex.
That's Jayna Kothari talking about the landmark Supreme Court of India judgment in 2014 in the NALSA versus Union of India case. While this was an important step towards gender equity and universal human rights in India, we obviously have miles to go for our laws, policies, governance, and society to become even remotely gender inclusive. In this first of 2 episodes on trans rights and gender equity, Tejas Pandey talks to Jayna Kothari on BIC Talks. Do tune in till the end and subscribe to the BIC Talks podcast to not miss the second episode on trans rights.
Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. Joining us today is Jayna Kothari, senior advocate who practices in the Supreme Court of India. She's the co-founder of the Centre for Law and Policy Research in Bangalore, and Jayna has argued in the Supreme Court in the recent constitutional challenges to Section 377 and adultery, which have both been decriminalized. Anchoring this episode is Tejas Pandey, who heads research communications at Azim Premji University and is a queer rights advocate. Tejas, over to you.
Thank you, Pavan. Jayna, welcome to the conversation. Every year, the International Pride Month is celebrated in the month of June and brings up extremely relevant questions that concern and shape the LGBTQIA community. Right now, in the United States, Black Lives Matter protests are increasingly demanding justice for women and the trans community who have suffered or lost lives at the hands of the police departments across the nation. Across the pond in Europe, the queer community in various large cities are lending their vocal support to the Black Lives Matter movement and confronting their own colonial legacies that have been oppressive, especially to the queer community. Now, back home in India, many sections of the queer community continue to oppose the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019. At the same time, we have been extremely shocked and saddened to read reports of deaths by suicide within the community, especially by our young adults. From conversion therapy to harassment to corrective rape, the picture seems quite grim. So we take a look at the judiciary and the executive to help us understand how we can ensure dignified lives to our most marginalized members. So, Jayna, to start with, let's take a look at the big news coming in from United States Supreme Court. Jayna, what was the recent US Supreme Court ruling regarding discrimination against gender and sexual minorities?
Hi, Tejas, and thank you for having me on this podcast. Recently, I think just last week, the US Supreme Court has passed quite a big judgment. This judgment is called Bostock versus Clayton County. And what the court held in this case is that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity would be outlawed under the Civil Rights Act in the US, and it would fall under sex discrimination. This was a case, just for those who don't know, this was a case where there were many people who, about 3 or 4 persons who were all thrown out of their jobs for being either gay or transgender. And the court actually took a very interesting way of arriving at the conclusion that this kind of termination from employment on the grounds of the fact that some people were gay or one person was transgender amounts to sex discrimination. And I'd like to take a minute to elaborate on that. What the court held is that under the Civil Rights Act in the US, sex is protected as a ground for discrimination. The court said that a person who was gay, who was fired when the employer came to know about his sexual orientation, was not fired because of his sexual orientation, but was fired because of his sex and the sex of his chosen partner. So in this case, let's take the case of one of the plaintiffs who was a male and he had a male partner. And so the court said that if it was a woman who had a male partner, the employer wouldn't have fired her. But because he is male and he happens to have a male partner, he is fired because of his sex. And similarly, the court held that another person who was transgender, who had transitioned during a break and then written to her employer saying that she identifies as female, and the employer fired her, and they interpreted it to say that if it was a person who was born female and said that she identified as female, the employer wouldn't have fired that person. But because in this case, the person was transgender and was born as a male and then later identified herself to be female, it was because of her sex. I think this is a very important judgment because it opens up the Civil Rights Act and discrimination based on sex to include sexual orientation and transgender status. But I think it's gone about in quite a convoluted way and in a different way than the way in which our courts have constitutionally protected the rights of transgender persons and persons who are of a different sexual orientation.
So that's quite interesting. And I would like to come back to the Indian question in a moment. But do you think that the US, in the way that it accords protection from discrimination to people who might identify as part of the homosexual, bisexual orientation, or who might be gender nonconforming, do you feel that that is unique in the way that the US offers those protections?
I think this is an interesting question. And I think this is unique in some ways to the way the US courts have kind of always reasoned. In the US, there is a comparator kind of jurisprudence, where they like to, courts use a comparator, that what if you were a male, or, use someone else to kind of give a reason that what was the discrimination really due to. But I think in other jurisdictions, this kind of reasoning is not necessarily used. In India, certainly it isn't. Even if you look at some of the European decisions, the reasoning is far more, I would say, sturdy in the sense that sex is expanded. And that's the same thing that we have done. Sex is expanded to include gender and gender identity, And I think that will go a much longer way, because if you take the US example, what if you have a case where you can't find another comparator, And so then what? But I think we have to understand different courts with their own histories, why the US Supreme Court reasoning was like this. Why did the lawyers argue this rather than just saying that sex should be expanded to include gender identity and sexual orientation? Maybe they thought it wouldn't fly. And maybe they thought the US Supreme Court is also much more conservative than our Supreme Court. Our courts have been quite activist in kind of expanding the meanings of many terms. Sometimes I think the court takes a much more stricter position that courts are not there to legislate and courts can only interpret. And if you give the meaning of a certain word, for example, in the Civil Rights Act, if you give an expanded meaning, it would amount to legislation, which is the role of Parliament and not the role of the court. So I would say that, I think these arguments were made keeping the US court in mind and obviously looking at what would be the best way to get a positive judgment.
Thank you for the elaboration. And when you mention the sort of progressive stances that our various courts in the Indian judiciary system have taken, could you tell us about some of these judgments that you refer to?
So one of the most important judgments has been a judgment of the year 2014. And this was a judgment which is popularly known as NALSA, NALSA versus Union of India. NALSA stands for the National Legal Services Authority versus Union of India. And this was a case that was brought, it was a public interest petition that was filed by the National Legal Services Authority in the Supreme Court seeking the recognition of rights of transgender persons. And the Supreme Court, for the first time, gave a really elaborate constitutional protection to transgender persons. And what was actually the most important of all is that, we have in our Constitution in Articles 14, 15, 16, many different fundamental rights which guarantee the right to equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex. What the court held is that sex cannot be understood just as one's biological features. Sex, the understanding for sex has to be expanded. Sex should include gender and gender attributes. In addition to biological attributes, it should include gender identity and gender expression. And so the court, expanded the meaning of sex. And with this expanded meaning of sex, what the court said that discrimination on the basis of sex would include discrimination on the basis of gender identity and one's gender expression. Fundamental freedoms under Article 19 of the Constitution, which include the freedom of speech and expression. And the court held that this freedom of speech and expression is not just to speak or write, but it is also to express your gender identity or just to express yourself by clothes, by mannerisms, by in any way, because that is also a form of expression. And it expanded the right to life to include the right to self-identify one's gender. And the court held that, one's gender identity or what you identify as your gender is not based on a medical or bodily or biological features, but it is how you psychologically or internally decide what your gender is. And that is one of a person's core kind of intimate decisions, and that is a part of one's right to life. So I think this was very important at so many levels, and I think that this judgment really started the kind of articulation of transgender rights really in the country. I mean, of course, there were trans rights movements, but I think this judgment really gave the language to articulate many of these issues and to articulate them in the context of constitutional fundamental rights.
Thank you. This sounds like an incredibly progressive sort of judgment. And before we move forward, I wanted to actually take a pause and look at the idea of discrimination faced by the trans community for a moment. If one was to read the newspaper, there are certain kinds of discriminatory acts at a societal level that seem to be better reported than others. But I wondered if one truly gets a picture of the kind of an experience that a trans person goes through on a day-to-day basis if one was to only rely on our news media. So, because I believe that the news media is also evolving with time to better report the kinds of experiences that gender minorities experience. So I wondered if we could sort of take a moment to talk about this, which might have also informed your legal practice when it comes to representing the issues of gender minorities.
I think in the media now you see a lot more coverage on trans issues than before. So I think that definitely is positive. But what you do see is that there is a really wide range of discrimination that the trans community faces. The violence at the hands of the police, that is a huge feature which is a constant in the lives of the trans community. They face high proportions of violence at the hands of the police. There is discrimination in employment, education, even qualified. First of all, the issue is that a lot of members from the trans community aren't able to complete education or get full access. That's because a lot of young gender non-conforming kids, discriminated at school, teased, ridiculed, made fun of, face stigma, and a lot of them are forced to drop out if they don't have support. If they drop out of school or, college, they aren't able to complete their education. They don't have enough educational qualifications to therefore get better employment. In employment as well, the ones who do get employment, their gender expression, gender identity is often not accepted. And so they face a lot of discrimination at work too. In housing, how many of them have places to stay? How many of them get housing? We heard about, a few years ago when the Kochi Metro issue was there, where the Kochi Metro Corporation, gave a large number of jobs to members from the trans community in their metro project. They were all ultimately were forced to leave the job because where they tried employment was based and they tried to get housing, they weren't able to get any housing at all because house owners were not willing to rent out their houses to these employees. And so ultimately, because they didn't have housing, they had to give up their jobs because they couldn't find any accommodation there. So there is discrimination at every level. We've seen now during the COVID lockdown period, trans people have been forced to, led to commit suicide for not having access to medication, not having access to food, and not having any other support. So there is discrimination at every level, and that's a serious issue that needs to be taken into account.
And I believe that the NALSA judgment actually addresses a lot of the issues that you've talked about by way of discrimination that the community faces. I wanted to take a moment and understand what the implication of the NALSA judgment is for those who are not yet adults or 18 years of age. What does the judgment actually mean for our young queer members?
Well, the judgment doesn't really distinguish on the basis of age. But I think, so for a young person, what the judgment really says is that you have the fundamental right to decide your gender identity and express yourself the way you want to, whether or not, you fall within the binary or not. You don't have to, choose the gender binary. You can be gender non-conforming, you can be male, female, basically decide your gender identity. And I think that is an important message for young persons who are still kind of deciding their own gender identity or who are gender non-conforming. And NALSA does lay down also some guidelines. NALSA, the judgment says that one is it gives a legal right to persons to decide their gender identity, and then it actually directs the state governments to provide reservations in public education and public employment for transgender persons. Now, this hasn't been done even now, even after 6 years of the judgment. So, it still has a long way to go.
What kind of issues have organizations that work with the trans community, as well as the state governments or sort of any sort of administrative unit under the state government, experienced while trying to implement the provisions of the NALSA judgment?
Actually, to be honest, not too many governments have even attempted to implement the NALSA judgment. The only state government where they have implemented reservations in public employment to some extent is Tamil Nadu, where they have included transgender persons within the MBC, or the most backward castes category of reservation. No other state that I know of has even provided any reservations in public employment or public education. Even the Tamil Nadu one is not perfect, and we have challenged some activists, and I'm representing them. We've challenged this in the Madras High Court, because what happens is that, we've argued for a separate reservation and not just within the MBC quota, because what ends up happening is that others, non-trans people from the MBC quota, get the reserved jobs because they get better grades, they get better marks, and the trans community is still the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. So even if they are grouped into any category, how do you ensure that they will get those jobs and not others? So this is still a battle that we're fighting in the court, but none of the other states have even provided reservations.
And I know that you may necessarily not have the answer for this, but why do you think that is?
It's not an important issue for the government. They don't see the trans community as a vote bank. No census has been done, so it seems, it's always seen as being a very, very small minority. It's the same kind of language, right, that was there in the Suresh Kaushal judgment of the Supreme Court, a minuscule minority. So, though it's not, but, we don't have the numbers because there isn't a census. And so it's not seen as a vote bank. It is not seen as a community that is really going to matter to the government. So, the government really doesn't care. What will it take to really shake up the government and say that, well, you have to, you can't get away with that? I wonder what that will be.
Other than reservation, in your view, what are the other kinds of measures that need to be taken up on an urgent basis at the state level so that we can secure sort of an improvement in the quality of life of the trans community right now?
So, of course, they need access and inclusion at every level, whether it is housing, healthcare, education, schools, universities, and public spaces, etc. Now, of course, it is the obligation of the state to provide that. But I think the only way that we can guarantee it to some extent is if we have an equality and an anti-discrimination law. So, we go back to the decision on the US Supreme Court that we started with. The US Supreme Court had a civil rights the US has a Civil Rights Act. We don't have anything comparable to a civil rights law which guarantees equality and which guarantees non-discrimination on the ground of gender identity. I mean, we don't even have a law that guarantees equality to so many categories, to women, for example, to trans people, to people on the basis of their sexual orientation, not in the private sector. So while we may have a constitutional kind of protection, constitutional protections are only kind of enforceable against public sector. What are you going to do if you apply for a job and the employer, a private employer says, well, I'm not going to employ you because I don't like the way you're cross-dressing or the way you decide your gender identity. So we don't have any legislation. When landlords don't give you a house on rent because of your transgender status, there is nothing that one can do because we don't have a law that prohibits such discrimination by landlords. So what I really think is that we need an equality law that really prohibits discrimination at all these kind of levels in housing, education, healthcare, public spaces, in employment, etc.
So it is interesting you should bring that up because in numerous conversations in public sphere as well as in the LGBT community, there is a belief that reading down of Section 377 of IPC and the Trans Act of 2019 are important steps towards sort of ensuring that. Would you agree with that notion?
I definitely think, the reading down of 377 was an extremely important step in the kind of march towards LGBTIQ equality. But it's just the first step because what reading down does is that it kind of decriminalizes consensual acts. And so there was such a shroud of criminality on LGBTQI persons. So at least that is removed. But I think decriminalization is just the first step. Okay, we've got decriminalization, but then how do we get positive rights? Are two people of the same sex allowed to marry? No, they're still not. Are they allowed to live together, have a family and have kids if they want to, or get benefits? Can they inherit each other's property? Can a transgender person adopt? We're facing these questions every day, and these things still have to be worked on. We still have to get these rights. And I think the decriminalization of 377 paved the way to now get these rights. So, there's a long way ahead.
And would you like to comment on the Trans Act 2019 as well?
Yeah, I mean, the Trans Act 2019 was brought into force last year. The Transgender Persons Act, for those who may not be very familiar with it, this was a law that, a draft bill that was being debated and being circulated for the last 3 or 4 years, actually since 2014, since several years. And then the final version was passed in 2019. This is a law that actually the trans community has rejected, and this is a law that was drafted entirely by the state, by the central government. The trans community had serious objections to several parts of the law, but these objections were not taken into account. And though it is, it's called the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019, it really does not even contain the rights that the NALSA judgment gave and guaranteed. So, one of the core issues that the trans community has against this law is that it mandates that if you want an identification or legal recognition, you can only be recognized as transgender. And one of the core kind of principles of the NALSA judgment is that your right to gender identity means that you can decide your gender as male, female, or transgender or other. So I should have the right, for example, to decide what gender I identify as. To then box me after the Supreme Court gave me this right to decide, and to then box me just as transgender is really, takes away the rights that Supreme Court gave. On one hand, you're taking it away on the other hand. A lot of trans people identify themselves as male or female, And so then this kind of takes away that right. The Trans Persons Act also, while it does have a section on discrimination and it prohibits discrimination, it does not have any teeth. So it does not have any provisions that, well, if an employer discriminates against you, then what? Is there any action that will be taken against the employer? Can you file a complaint? Nothing. So it's completely toothless. So just merely putting kind of anti-discrimination provisions without any remedies, it will not enforce it at all. So there are serious issues with the Act. The Act has been challenged in the Supreme Court. And so, yes, we have to await the outcome.
So thank you. That was actually really quite useful to know, because the next question that I had was, what is the way forward for the trans community as they see it now that they see their lives being defined in some ways by the Trans Act? And this is a two-part question, if I may just sort of elaborate a little bit more. One is this, and the other is that there are many other laws that affect the trans and GNC communities, like, for instance, the Telangana UNACS Act, directly and indirectly. So I wondered if you could sort of elaborate on that as well.
So I'll just speak about the Telangana UNACS Act first. So the Telangana UNACS Act it's a 100-year-old law. It's a colonial legislation that was enacted in the state of Andhra Pradesh and later Telangana. It was a brief law which basically criminalized gender non-conforming persons, transgender persons, gender minorities. And what the Act stated is that, it used the colonial term eunuchs and provided many different clauses that if a eunuch is found on the street in female clothes, performing, dancing, then it would be a criminal offense. If a transgender person is found with a minor child, that would amount to an offense because it was assumed that person is kidnapping young boys and, performing unnatural offenses. So basically, many such acts were criminalized. And this is again going back to Section 377, where especially, even within the LGBTI community, especially trans community is kind of particularly much more vulnerable because of these kind of laws. So we challenged this act in the Telangana High Court, has stayed the operation of that law. And now moving forward, first, kind of, I just want to tie in, to your second question, that what's next, So I think the first step in trans equality really was to challenge criminal laws. And I think that phase has happened, 377 has been decriminalized with regard to consensual acts. The Telangana UNACS Act has been stayed. We had a similar criminal provision in Karnataka, Section 36A, which again criminalized eunuchs, again in quotes, and that has been amended. So we've gone past the criminalization kind of stage. We've challenged criminal laws. The next stage really is for positive rights, because ultimately, like any other community, what does the trans community really want? Basic, all other facets of life in marriage, adoption, property, family life, in employment, education, healthcare, basically all facets of our daily life. And that is something we have to now address. Should we change our existing laws to ensure that they are not just male, female covered, that they encompass transgender persons, it encompasses gender identity and sexual orientation? Do have to do that. I think in addition to changing our existing laws, we also need an overarching law. So, just for example, like sexual harassment, we have a law that prevents sexual harassment of women at the workplace. Now, it is a fact that a large number of transgender persons at work are sexually harassed, but the law does not cover trans persons explicitly. What about domestic violence law? So, we have a whole range of existing legislations that may need a review. And at the same time, I think we need another overarching legislation to ensure that there's no discrimination in all other areas. So, yeah, there's a lot of work to do.
I ask this as a member of the community who may not understand the intricacies of law. How does one go about proving discrimination that is taking place against you when the discriminating person flatly denies? Or sort of the reason for discrimination can be shrouded under other reasons?
And it's an important question because it's not always easy to prove discrimination. And it all depends on individual cases, what exactly happened in that case. And ultimately, even if there is discrimination, you'll have to prove it in court. Sometimes it's your word against another person, an employer's word, whether you have proof. Can you prove by evidence that this, you were discriminated or fired because of your sexual orientation or because of your gender status? So it's not easy. But, we're not even at that stage. We don't even have an avenue to do that. So today, the way the plaintiffs in the US could go to court and say that I was fired unfairly because of my sexual orientation or because of my gender identity. Today in India, we can't do that. Even if you are fired because of that, you can't do that. So how do we enable that? We have to get to a stage where we enable someone to be able to do that.
As we move along our sort of judicial fights from criminal laws to more positive rights-based laws, how sensitive do you find our judiciary, especially our high courts, to be?
I think the high courts and the judges at the various high courts are extremely positive on this question. I'm only responding to this question. Extremely positive, and that has happened because of two things. One is, of course, the big judgments of the Supreme Court. We had the NALSA judgment, and then we had the 2018 Navteej Johar versus Union of India judgment, where Section 377 was and both these judgments, maybe even the right to privacy judgment that came a year earlier in 2017, all these judgments really kind of said unequivocally that the right to sexual orientation, the right to gender identity are important aspects of one's right to life. And so, one is you have the Supreme Court judgments. So, the High Court judges are, of course, aware of this and open to this. And I think the second thing is socially, there is more acceptance. There is, I wouldn't say, I think there is an improvement in the acceptance of transgender persons. It's not enough because there is still a lot of discrimination going on. But I think what the movement has done, and, it has been the campaign and the movement that has kind of led to some of these decisions. But I think socially there is also a lot more acceptance. So I think the judges have been at the High Court level very, very open and progressive. The decisions, the cases that we filed in different high courts found extremely progressive and interested judges. And so the judiciary is very, very interested. But it is the state government that refuses to grant these rights. So we are still battling against a wall, and that wall is the government.
Right. So on that hopeful note, Jayna, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you, Tejas. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Jayna. Thank you, Tejas. Thank you for joining us on BIC Talks. Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.